Before I'd left the house this morning, I'd received 3 very different pieces of life advice. The first one was an Instagram post that told me to trust my gut. The second was a podcast episode on an early morning walk that told me to get out of my comfort zone. And the third was a daily journal prompt that told me to, and this is one of my favourites, feel the fear and do it anyway. Now, I don't know about you, but on some days when these are flying at me, all I can sense is the contradiction between those at any given moment. And these quotes, I know, are intended to affect the way that we think in a great way. What I also know from cognitive behavioural psychology and this triangle is that the way we think affects how we feel, and the way we feel affects how we act. So if I'm being thrown between trusting my gut and my instincts and feeling fear, how am I actually meant to know which of those I'm feeling in any given moment on a particular day? How am I meant to know when discomfort is a red flag and when it's a green light? And knowing the difference between those two things feels really important to me, because if how I interpret that affects how I show up every day, then I really need to know. And that was an important investigation for me. Now, for me to understand the difference, I turned first to my professional life. And let me tell you why. So I've divided my time between 3 very distinct professional worlds for several years. Each of them are very, very different, but they've all taught me unique things and given me unique insights into how people interpret and understand the way that they think and feel every day. Now, 20 years of my life has been spent as an academic, and the last few years of that I've been a senior lecturer in law and policing at the University of Tasmania. Now I teach law, investigative interviewing and supporting the detective course at Tasmania Police, and I've recently left that role, but that's been 20 years of my life. For the last 9 years, I also did extra training and started my business supporting corporate leaders and purpose-driven business owners in my business, Human Actually. And then 6 years ago, I added another ring, and that was buying one of the largest yoga and Pilates studios in Tasmania called Udara. So 3 very different environments. But about 12 months ago, I decided after 6 years of police influence, it's very addictive, I wanted to become an investigator myself. Primarily because I wanted to understand, when can I actually trust the way that I'm feeling, and when should I investigate further? And so I asked the question, how much can those 3 very different professional worlds actually teach me about the difference between my gut instinct, feeling fear, and getting out of my comfort zone, truly? And it turns out they could teach me quite a lot. So I'm going to share the results of that investigation with you today, and each of the clues that those environments have given me about when to trust and when to test the way that I think and feel. So let's start with the policing world. Police officers gather and test evidence. They do that by making and testing hypotheses, and they investigate what might have happened in criminal cases. Now, many great police officers that I taught, who'd been police officers for a very long time, talked to me about having this sense of intuition after many years of the work that they did. The excellent investigators, though, talked about acknowledging that feeling and going beyond it. In fact, gathering evidence that proved that they weren't right in some cases. And I remember one particular investigator who I had a lot of time for. His name was Peter. He'd been a detective for 30 years. And in showing him a training video that he had incorrectly thought the interviewee was lying in, he said to me, "Kate, that's why we need to keep testing our instincts, because we don't want to have cognitive bias." After 30 years, he was very across trusting his gut and his instincts, but he never forgot to keep looking for evidence to the contrary. Now, I was trained as part of my academic role with the Centre for Investigative Interviewing here in Australia under the team of Professor Martine Powell. And one of the things that I did as a trainer was to help police officers test assumptions about how interviewees, witnesses, offenders behave in interview, and with some misconceptions about memory. So the research shows that cues that you might often associate with lying, like shuffling on a seat or not making much eye contact or pausing a lot during an interview, the research shows that it's actually far too ambiguous to be treated as evidence of truth. And in actual fact, many of those elements are actually the influence of culture or age or fear or trauma or a myriad of other factors. So from my experience with officers and learning about how they test experience, I knew I wanted to be a good investigator for this investigation. And that meant I had to look at what my first assumptions were, and I had to look for evidence to the contrary. So when it comes to the policing world, evidence lived outside of us or outside of me. But in the movement and Pilates space that I own my business, Udara, that evidence, the movement world, evidence lives inside of us. So whenever we step onto a yoga mat or a reformer machine or any type of movement that we do, our body is sending us sensations and it's having conversations with us all the time. Now, those conversations are information and data for our investigation as well. And I think of a situation in my own life where this was very clear to me after a period of investigation. About 4 years ago, my son Spencer had open heart surgery in Melbourne, and it was a trying time. It was a highly emotional, traumatic period where you're just putting one foot in front of the other. My husband and I had to swap with one person in the room at a time in 2021, and I was really stressed. Now, at that time, I had small children. Any of the parents in the room will acknowledge that this might be the case. I had small children, so I loved boxing for fitness. It helped me get out of my head and the parenting experience and into my body. And so my husband very thoughtfully booked me a session one-on-one with a boxing coach at the hospital gym. And so down I went thinking, this is great. This is going to distract me. Our darling son is being taken care of by my husband. Everything will be fine. Every time I tried to punch, I would burst into tears. I was quite embarrassed at the time, and I kept saying to the trainer, "I'm really sorry. I do really want this. It's not you, it's me." And yet, every time I tried, I was completely overwhelmed by emotion. And I had to stop and go back to the room. Neuroscientists and somatic psychologists would know that that's an example of this process called interoception, which is the body's way of sensing and interpreting how we feel based on bodily emotions, whether that's our heart rate, whether that's muscle tension, our breath, or in my case, it was tears. So for me, what was actually happening was I was incredibly overwhelmed at that time. And I was incredibly emotional. And my brain was trying to say, "Kate, you need to go slowly and go gently." And I listened. And from then on, as we were supporting him over that time in hospital, I could only gently walk laps around City Park and I could do gentle yoga. So when we move our bodies, we're actually becoming embodied investigators, about what's really happening for us, whether it's in our soul or in our brain. Just because, though, I feel a particular way doesn't mean I'm going to know straight away what it is. That was pretty obvious that time. But in the coaching world, I've learnt some really important lessons about the way we interpret what we think. So I know out of habit, and because I shine a light on myself a lot with this, I will often interpret what something means through a lens of a story I've repeated for years about myself. Or when my brain is stressed, it will reach for what is really practiced. My brain thinks it's true because I think it all the time, but it's the safe zone when I'm stressed. And so the coaching lens has taught me to question what I think is true. And at Human, actually, in my business, what I see all the time are incredible humans who understand on a conceptual level that courage doesn't feel good. They know that courage is meant to feel awkward in the body. But then the opportunity to be courageous then presents itself. They're filled with anxiety and dread and nausea. And they go, oh no, that's a message. It's telling me this is not right for me. It's not the right time. So when the emotional opportunity to test courage turns up, I often see people step back. And I get it. The brain is wired to keep us alive. From an evolutionary perspective, if it senses danger or difference or something new, of course it retreats. But in terms of the coaching world, I see this all the time. If we can get behind those automatic reactions and ask questions about those, we can better and more clearly receive messages about what we really think and feel. And people often talk to me about intuition, for example. And intuition is an interesting one. So I looked at the research on intuition. And the Australian researcher Joel Pearson has a brilliant definition and framework, and I recommend you have a look at it. And he defines intuition as the learned, productive use of unconscious information for better decisions and action. And he uses an acronym for a toolkit called SMILE. And I recommend you have a look at that. For my investigation, for this investigation of the mixed messages in our universe, I looked particularly at the first two of those. The first is self-awareness and the second is mastery. Now, when it comes to self-awareness, this is about acknowledging when you're approaching a decision and you're not sure how you're feeling about it, your state is really important. So if I am approaching a decision and I feel discomfort or fear, I might think it's intuition, but if I'm exhausted and hangry, chances are it's actually a result of a train wreck of emotions caused by crashing blood sugar, and I probably just need a good feed and a good sleep before I trust anything my brain is telling me, or probably both. Anyone who's ever suffered hunger in the audience, being hungry and angry, will know exactly what I mean by that. We don't trust ourselves, and we shouldn't until we are more regulated. Now, when it comes to mastery, the second of Joel Pearson's steps, what mastery is really telling us is intuition cannot speak to us in a situation that is unfamiliar. So when you think your intuition is speaking to you and it's an entirely new situation or an entirely new emotion, it's highly unlikely to be intuition, and it's more likely to be discomfort or fear or uncertainty of some kind. So, 3 professional lenses. Where does that leave us then with the question of how do we know when and how to trust how we think and how we feel in a world full of mixed messages? Each of those professional worlds has really given me a different insight and a different way to be an investigator. So the policing world has taught me to question what I see and experience. The movement world taught me to listen to how I feel. And the coaching world has taught me to test what I believe, particularly when I believe it to be true. So what I've realised ultimately is that self-trust of how I think and feel can only come when I integrate them. When all of those feature in how I assess big decisions in my life. Now, I've worked with police for 7 years, so I knew I needed an acronym. Acronyms are everywhere in the policing world. And this is the acronym that best represented for me the framework that I use when I am approaching a decision and there's hesitation or fear. And I don't know if it's my gut instincts or getting out of my comfort zone. But this is a process that I use that I wanted to share with you to help with perhaps asking more questions so you can understand how you think and feel too. And it's called INVEST. Testing before trusting, discernment before decision making. And here's what those letters stand for. So I stands to identify what you're feeling. So before you do anything, you need to understand that you might be feeling fear, tension, uncertainty, excitement. For me, I often use the example, if you've got someone who says to you, hey, you should apply for this new role at work. It's an amazing role, you're amazing at it, but it's 2 rungs above what you're doing right now, a new organisation. You're probably likely to feel fear, tension, maybe excitement. So you always need to identify the feelings first. But then it's about noticing the state where you're assessing that decision and whether you should go for it or not. So noticing your state, this is about, are you feeling rested and calm and energised right now? Because if you've come off the back of 2 long, exhausting weeks at work, your nervous system might just not be capable of assessing a new courageous work possibility. It might just be saying, I'm tired. And my darling daughter Poppy and I have a process that we use at night time if she's tired and a worry comes up. And we say, remember, darling, not now, brown cow. And then we look at that worry again in the morning when we're not tired. It's a great process of being regulated. So Joel Pearson's research shows us we need a regulated state for intuition to talk to us. So verifying your experience, one of my favourite questions that I ask almost everyone that I work with or see or talk to is, okay, great, fear, uncertainty, what does the evidence actually say? So you might not have evidence of applying for a role exactly the same as what you're doing, but I'll bet you've had evidence in the past of where you've done something that frightened you and it turned out okay. Or that perhaps you've done something uncertain or even just applied for the next role or your graduate role and that turned out okay. When we ask what evidence we actually have, we often find that there's more evidence there that we can do this than we can't. We don't want to confuse the idea of inexperience with intuition. And now once you verify that, you need to explore the possibilities. So if I was to stay in this role, what would that look like? If I was to apply for this role, what could my work look like then or my life look like then? This is about testing hypotheses, weighing up options, because we always have more than one. And it's really important that you then sense check that with your values, because it may be that your gut is saying, this organisation is not aligned with my values, the industry is not aligned to what I want, and therefore it is saying to step away. So yeah, you might be fearful, yeah, you might want to feel the fear and do it anyway, but it's a misalignment of values, and that's important too. But it might just be that that nausea is evidence of a stretch. So as well as sense checking it with your values, it's about taking deliberate action. So when you're wanting to take deliberate action, it's not about taking every action you possibly could and going 20 steps ahead. What's the next thing I can do? I can update my CV and I can get my application in. Intentional micro steps help when it comes to dealing with that level of uncertainty. So you don't have to do all of the steps in the INVEST framework every time you make a decision, but if there's uncertainty, it can be a good place for you to start. So if you're ever feeling unclear, come back to a process like this. Invest is actually about stopping yourself reacting to how you feel and letting you understand it so that you can actually act on the best evidence that you have available, like a great investigator does. So my investigation is now closed, and I've learned a lot about how to reframe the way I think and feel and when to trust that every day through those 3 professional lenses. From the police, I learnt to be an external investigator, to gather evidence beyond what my intuition is telling me. In movement, I became an embodied investigator, trusting the way I move and the way I feel. And then as a coach, I learnt to be an internal investigator, questioning those beliefs. So those morning quotes weren't really cliches for me. They weren't contradictory. They were invitations for how we might think about our life every day. Whether they're relevant or not will depend on how we reframe the way we think and we feel, and we turn that into data that we can investigate. So when we become investigators of this human experience that we have, we stop asking if we can trust ourselves, and we finally do.